Our speaker tonight is Rabbi Stuart Altshuler, Rabbi of Temple Beth Shalom. You have heard his resume many times before, so I will refrain from repeating it.
I'm not getting any sound.
Somebody's got their computer going here.
Okay. Many on this Zoom have heard Rabbi Altshuler before. If this is your first time, sit back, pop open a Diet Coke, and enjoy the next hour. With that, I turn the microphone over to Rabbi Altshuler.
Thank you, Marshall. You don't have to have a Diet Coke. You can have other delights as well. I don't mind eating, whatever you want to do. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I wish that the news of the day wasn't so appropriate to what we're discussing tonight. But this is life, and we have to come to grips with it. Not only have we had a pandemic to deal with the last, whatever, year and a half, now we have a return, I guess, of terrorism and that fear hanging over us. So we're in this together, and I suppose we need to talk about it. We are discussing what perhaps is the greatest liturgical composition ever composed, either whether it be Jewish or not, the Unetenah Tokef, which many have said is the essence. It's the core. If you didn't do anything else on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and just studied, prayed, and thought about Unetenah Tokef, you will already be 95% of the way in understanding what the high holidays, what brings us together. It's quite an amazing piece. And we're going to look at it together. I hope you certainly, I know all of you are somewhat familiar with the Mi Yichiyeh, Mu Yamut, who will live and who will die, that the staccato-like questions that are asked, who will be successful, who will not be. I lost the screen here, but are we okay? Okay. I can't see. Okay, good. That's better. So this is the heart of the high holidays, and I thought it would be a good way of bringing us together in synagogue, which we will be in just a short period of time. You know, my first introduction at Unetenah Tokef came from my grandmother, Lena of blessed memory, my father's mother. And she was old school. She was from Pinsk, only spoke Yiddish. And that's the way I grew up. Very devout, very pious. But we were able to talk. I was a young kid. She died when I was 15 years old, but we had enough of her visits to the home. She was a very old-fashioned Eastern European shtetl Jew. And what I do remember, if you mention the word Unetenah Tokef to her, she would almost start crying right away. Because what my father said that what he remembered as a kid with his mother and father in the synagogue in Chicago, which is where they were. The cantor of their synagogue was the great cantor Yosela Rosenblatt. He was a tremendous cantor. I guess there are a few old recordings of his, but he was really something else. But my father said that when Yosela Rosenblatt chanted Unetenah Tokef in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he said especially the ladies in the ladies section would start crying and yelling and just in hysteria at the emotions. He said he remembered the women pounding their feet on the floor and crying and weeping as the Unetenah Tokef was recited. That was the emotions of the old days. Our fellow Jews, and then your ancestors as well, took it quite seriously. Who will live and who will die, and what does all this mean? So I'd like to go in a little bit deeper level here and try to understand that emotion of that generation and perhaps understand our own emotions as we approach the high holidays and what this prayer means to us. In sum, before we discuss the origins of the Unetenah Tokef, in sum, it's about why human beings suffer, why bad things happen to good people, if you want to expand the subject. And just keep in mind, as before we look at the text, is that there are two types of suffering, of evil in the world, and they're all mentioned in the Unetenah Tokef, because there's a mention of swords, which is about a symbol for man-made suffering, or 12 Marines getting killed by a bomb. That wasn't a natural event. It was caused by human beings, evil ones. And we know the history of humanity. Human beings have suffered enormously at the hands of other human beings. The other type of suffering is the other part of our existence, and that is natural suffering, viruses, illnesses. The Unetenah Tokef prayer refers to plagues. We've certainly lived through a plague. And so we have both of those parts that weighed upon our people throughout all the generations, but still a very contemporary part of our existence, precariousness of our lot in life. About God, what is our relation with God then? What can we human beings do about this very fragile part of what we know as the reality of human existence? So before we get into the text, let me give you a little bit of what we know about the origins of the text, the origin of the Unetenah Tokef. It is allegedly assumed that a Rabbi Amnon composed this Unetenah Tokef from between the 11th century and the 13th century. But scholars disagree. Why those centuries? Because the first time this prayer ever exists in any manuscript is in the 13th century, uncovered by a Rabbi Yitzchak of Vienna. That's why this piyut, or liturgical piece, is the fancy word is piyut, appears only in Ashkenazic Machzorim. And my guess is that some Sephardic traditions have embraced it. I'm not certain, I'm not Sephardic, but generally it's definitely a part of the Ashkenazic tradition, of which we are a part of. Then it appears in a Kabbalistic manuscript for a couple hundred years later in 1586 in the text called Shalshelet by a Sephardic Rabbi Gedalia ibn Yahya. And that generally means that it was composed in Eretz, or that text was from Eretz Yisrael, from the beautiful community, Kabbalistic community of Tzfat. So it's interesting. It was in the Sephardic tradition of the 16th century and seems to have dropped out as an Ashkenazic piece. And perhaps we'll be able to understand why it is particularly Ashkenazic. Then it appears again in 1602, written in Yiddish, in a book of Yiddish tales that were very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. But most scholars agree, I give you the full, I can't go through all the scholarly work, but most scholars agree that it was composed long before the 13th century, before Rabbi Yitzchak's text appears for the first time. And it had a long history of being part of the, which was very common in Jewish life before there were actual printed prayer books, of a lot of poetry and folktale collections that were passed on, as you see here, originally in Hebrew, and then transposed into Yiddish, and then retranslated again into the Hebrew. So it has a very interesting, a lot of speculation about its composition, but I'm going to get to where most scholars agree where it comes from. But here's the tale that accompanies, which we don't have in our Machzor, but was part of the original composition of the Unetenah Tokef. So follow me. Rabbi Amnon doesn't say where he was from. He was approached by the local bishop in his town who said, Rabbi Amnon, it's time you convert to Christianity. So Rabbi Amnon said, listen, I need 3 days to think about it. So he went back home. And when he went back home, he felt terrible remorse for even giving the bishop 3 days for making that kind of absurd. There was nothing to think about. He would never convert. So he was supposed to appear back before the bishop in 3 days, and he didn't come. So the bishop was very upset. He was perturbed by this tremendous slight. He didn't slight the bishop. So he sent his soldiers, which was very common. The church officials all had their armies, as did the Pope. They had their armies, and their local bishops did. And they went after the rabbi to bring Rabbi Amnon back to the bishop. So Amnon was dragged back, and the bishop said, why didn't you appear when you were supposed to? And Amnon said, I should never have promised to even give you a hint that I was interested in converting. And Amnon said to the bishop, it was a grievous sin that I did that. I should never have opened my mouth. And so therefore I deserve to have my tongue cut out of my mouth. So as a result of his sin, that's how remorseful he felt. And the bishop said, I'm going to do more than that. You should have been here. Therefore, this is a sin of your feet. And I'm going to add to your sin as a sin of your hands as well. And I'm going to cut off your feet and your hands, which, according to the legend, the bishop did. We're going to talk about whether that is possible or not. So what was left of Rabbi Amnon was carried back on a stretcher back to the Jewish quarter. And when Rosh Hashanah arrived, Rabbi Amnon, because it was his synagogue, I hope this doesn't happen to your rabbi. He had no arms and no legs. And he was sitting right next to the Shliach Tzibur, who was not Cantor Geigner in the 13th century. It was someone else. And he sat next to the Shliach Tzibur and was praying along with the congregation until they got to the Kedusha, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And he said, stop. And that's when, according to the legend, he recited the Unetenah Tokef prayer for the congregation. That's why we still recite it before the Kedusha of the Musaf. And after he finished reciting the prayer, it says, according to the legend, Rabbi Amnon disappeared into heaven and he was taken by God. Now, you should know that the only biblical personality who was taken by God like that was Elijah. And you'll see in the reference in the text, there's a very important reference to Elijah and the importance of Elijah in the Unetenah Tokef prayer. So it says that 3 days after that happened, after he disappeared, he came back, just like Elijah. That's why we have Elijah's cup at the Passover table, and why we have Elijah's chair at a Brit Milah, the circumcision, because the hope is that our children, the Brit Milah, will be, one day they might be the Messiah, bring the great glory, because Elijah never dies. So Elijah might live in our children. And that's the same reason at Passover we welcome Elijah, because he never really died. He comes back. That has a long, complicated history, and it's part of the Unetenah Tokef prayer. So he came back to a Rabbi Kalamenos, which was a very common name back in the early Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. He taught the rabbi this prayer, and he told the rabbi to publicize this and make sure the Jews recited this prayer forever and ever, which we still do every year. Rosh Hashanah 2 days and on Yom Kippur. Now, is the story true or not? Probably not. There's a lot of Baba Maisa in here, and the fact that it was told to us in a folk tale says a lot about, things were embellished. That's the way our grandparents learned stories. They weren't in the Torah text itself or in the Talmud. This was part of the folk literature. However, what is interesting is the backdrop of the story, sadly, was very much a part of the truth that Jews lived with during a great part of the Middle Ages, especially during the times of the oppression of the Catholic Church upon Jews. There was a great deal of martyrdom, Kiddush Hashem, of Jews during the Middle Ages, especially after the 11th century, not so much before, but after the 11th century with the beginnings of the First Crusade in 1096. There were three major crusades, and a lot of Jewish communities were wiped out, given the choice to convert or die, and most of our ancestors chose to die rather than convert to Christianity. It's a long story. And Kol Nidre, by the way, there's a lot of themes that run through here, is all about welcoming apostate Jews back into the community. A lot of Jews converted to Christianity, and the day after they had buyer's remorse and said, I renounced, I want back in the Jewish world. And so these vows became very important. That's why we have Kol Nidre, which has a different history, but we see a lot of the themes interwoven in the Unetenah Tokef prayer as well. We have uncovered a lot of different texts from, especially from the 11th century and the 12th century, and we see a lot of similar motifs in the kind of things that Jews were experiencing and reading in that period. And the specific geographical location for most of these motifs is from Italy, Italian Jews who live very close, of course, to the power of the Catholic Church, the Vatican in Rome. We know of many accounts, this is where we get into the true parts of the Unetenah Tokef, of Jews, sadly, who had their hands and feet chopped off on a regular basis for not being willing to convert to Christianity. That's a fact of the period. There were worse things that happened, like death, but it was a very common punishment in local communities for that to happen. So while it's a folk tale, there was a lot of basis and truth to it. And of course, to Jews, they drew strength from these tales to show how Jews were able to withstand, even though they had no physical ability to defend themselves, to withstand this kind of horror that was the domination of the church during these very, very difficult periods. So in sum, that's kind of the backdrop. By the way, why not only do we have these motifs in Italian Jewish literature, we also have, for example, the name Amnon was a very common name for Italian Jews, unlike any other place, because Italian Jews, we know, named themselves after biblical characters, and especially the lesser known biblical characters. So that's also was a tie to Italy. Amnon, for those of you who don't know, was King David's eldest son, who got into a lot of trouble because when his sister Tamar was raped by Avshalom, this is in the Tanakh, Amnon took revenge for his sister and killed David's son, his half-brother, Avshalom. And Amnon, because he had that sin, that was a name that a lot of Italian Jews embraced. And of course, we have the theme here of Amnon's sin and the attempt to do repentance. So all of that became very important. Also, the name Joseph was very important. And what we have here is this resistance by Rabbi Amnon to submit to this forced conversion. So many scholars believe this was written long before it was printed. It might even date back to the 10th century. And there's one scholar who I read who feels that it dates back to the 6th and 7th century, written by a very famous Jewish poet from the Arabian Peninsula named Yanai. But that's kind of a stretch. most believe it was Middle Ages, either before or during the Crusades in that period, from Italy, and written to really express a lot of the trauma that Jews were going through. So you can imagine the questions that Jews were asking about, why was this happening to our people? Why are we so defenseless? Where is our God? What is going on here? Why is God doing this to us? Why is God testing us? Mi yichyeh, mi yamut. Who's going to live this next year and who's going to die? These were very real questions that came out of this period. We live in much more greater comfort, so we can take a step back, but you can imagine how vivid these words were. Now, so the question is, in the context, why is God doing, why did the innocent suffer? So I think now what I'd like to do is share my screen with you. Oops, that's the wrong one. Here it is. Can you see? Just nod your head. Good. Okay, so if we were to look at this, I don't know if we need to go through the whole thing, but some things I want to show you. And this is it's an okay translation. I wouldn't say it's the greatest, but it works. Let us describe. We have been given to describe the Tokef, the power of this day. I would have translated that as power. Kiddush, a power of the Keddushat Hayom, of the sanctity of today. Again, the word Kedusha, this is recited just before the Kedusha. And what you see here in the literature is this brilliant, I mean, you imagine the 11th century asking the question, God, where are you? What kind of holiness of the day can we have when all this stuff is swirling around us, human beings? We're like pawns. Kihu Nora Ayom, because this day it is Nora, awesome and powerful, frightening. Yamim Noraim, we call the days Rosh Yom Kippur, Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. It comes from the Unetenah Tokef, right here. Uvotina Semachutecha, and your kingdom is uplifted on this day. Now, notice in the Musaf section after the Kedusha, there are 3 sections that I will introduce. Most of our people leave after the rabbi's sermon. They miss the latter part of the service. But I want to give you an idea where it all comes from. There are 3 sections, the Malchuyot and the Zichronot and the Shofarot. And we see this, all this was broken down because of the Unetenah Tokef. The first part is the Malchuyot, God's kingdom. In this prayer is called into question. Hamelech, how can God be the king of the universe? As you will see this emotional buildup that takes place. So I want you to note there is an irony in the text, making almost challenging God. This is supposed to be the day in which we set God's chesed, his love of your throne, your power. And you're supposed to sit upon it, be'emet, in truth. What kind of truth can there be if our people are being slaughtered? Emet, 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 truth. Ki atahu dayan, because you're supposed to be the ultimate judge. Mochiach, yodea, va'ed, and you reprove and you know and you witness for humanity. The way I read the text is, God, this is not happening according to script. V'chotev, v'chotem, the beautiful literature, the repetition of the words, and it's written and sealed. You know, we say in the text, maybe be written in the book of life, and in the Elah say we may be sealed in the book of life. This is where it comes from. Unetenah Tokef may be written and sealed and inscribed and counted. Notice the staccato-like emphasis of the words, as if to say, this is supposed to happen, this is supposed to happen, this is supposed to happen, this is supposed to happen. It's not happening. V'tizkor, zichronot, God's memory. You are supposed to, I'm adding words to the translation. This is my own shtick, but I think it's very important to understand the essence here. You are supposed to remember everything that's forgotten. Kol hanishkachot. And you're supposed to open the book of all memories. And from it, it shall be called and sealed the hand, the power of God upon every human being. Malchuyot, Zichronot, what's the last one? Shofarot, the shofar, the revelation. And in the V'shofar Gadol Yitaka, and the great shofar is to be sounded. And the voice, now we have Elijah. The voice, the quiet, still voice shall be heard. Remember Elijah, he disappeared. Remember, Elijah runs away from Ahab. This is I'm just giving you the rundown of the biblical text. And Ahab says, Elijah says, where are you, God? And then there's a great fire. And Elijah says, God's not in the fire. And then there's an earthquake, and Elijah understands not in the earthquake. And a great wind, and God's not in the wind. Finally, God says, you will hear the voice of God in the quiet, still voice. It will be heard. So through the centuries, Jews believed in Elijah that this quiet voice was the most powerful voice. And you have the author here questioning where this kol demama, where is this quiet voice coming from? How come we can't hear it? The angels are scattering. The angels are referred to in the Kedusha. That's why this is always read before the Kedusha. And there's supposed to be trembling and earth-shattering taking a hold. And they v'yomru hine yom hadin, and they're supposed to say, this is the day of judgment. We call Rosh Hashanah Yom Hadin. You'll hear that often. Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembrance, Yom Hadin, Yamim Noraim. It's all here in Unetenah Tokef. God's supposed to leave code, supposed to keep track. Pikudim are little notes, keeping track of every detail of everyone who marches by from above, who marches in law in deen. Because we do not merit in your eyes any judgment. It's almost sarcastically saying, what kind of life is this? We're disappearing, we're being slaughtered. And this is almost like the author is almost like saying, what kind of game are you playing with us? This is a very important verse here. Everybody in the world, Ya'avrun, comes before you. And this word is repeated over and over in Unetenah Tokef. I didn't count how many times, but I would guess at least 10 times in the rest of the text. Avera is a transgression, and avar also means the past. It's almost as if the author is saying, humanity transgresses and we suffer. We're passing before you because of the transgressions of others and the weirdness of this world before you. Kivnei maron, like sheep going to the slaughter. This became a very important motif, obviously, during the Shoah, why Jews were marched to their deaths like sheep to the slaughter. Like a sheep. We're like sheep. You're the shepherd was considered David and Moses. You're the most powerful entity on earth. We're like your little sheep. If we go astray, you're supposed to keep us together. That's a very important motif, the shepherd motif. Ma'avir, do you see that? Passing through his flock under his scepter, like Moses. This is the word used for Moses's power. Kain ta'avir, look, 3 times. We will pass through and be numbered, and you will count us. V'tiv kod, look at the beautiful literary use of the tav, and you will count the soul of every human being. V'tachtoch tzeva l'chol briotecha, and you will remember the ending of all your creation. So it's not just a Jewish problem, it's also a universal problem. The Kitov Gezar Dinam, and you will write the decree. Oops, wrong one. So that's the word. And then after that drama, the very famous Rosh Hashanah yikatevu v'yom som kippur yechatemun. So we have the written and the inscribed again. Wait just a minute, I lost the place here. Whoops. So written and sealed. Kama ya'avrun. How many? Here we have the avar again. How many will transgress? Or does it mean how many will be born? Chama yebareun. How many will be created? Miyichem yamut, will live, will die. Whose years will be cut short, and whose will not be cut short, who will die by water. Here we have natural suffering, floods, umi ba'esh. Now, not only was that a reference to national suffering, but remember, a lot of Jews were drowned to death. They were thrown into the waters and drowned, and they were also burned in their synagogues alive by fire. Bibacherev, who among us are going to be killed by swords? They didn't have guns then. So that's, by the way, we also know how old this is. People died by the sword. And also here's natural suffering, who died by animals, chaya, who will die by hunger, who will die by thirst, who will be by great noise, and who, this is relevant to us, who will die by plague, illness. Mi b'chanika, by strangulation, and who by stoning. These are all great ways that people died or were murdered. Who will have rest and who will be moved, who will have quiet, who will be torn apart by animals, who will sink low this year and who will be at peace, who will be poor and who will be rich, who will be low and who will be raised. So God, you have a long list of what we live with every day. But why this is a great piece of literature is that the writer provides an answer to the questions that are raised in the book of Job, but aren't answered very well. That's a whole different book we'll study at some point. But the author provides an interesting theological alternative and says, and we'll have to analyze what this means, through teshuvah, repentance, and through tefillah, through prayer, and through tzedakah, which is gimilut chasadim, doing deeds of loving kindness. It's not just charity of money, it's also charity of deed. Ma'avirin, here's a play on the word again. We can alleviate or pass over. It doesn't mean eliminate. It means we can kind of alleviate or pass over. See, this is a bad translation, no. I will bet you that our Machzor has a much better translation, which I should have looked up. See, I'm not relying on the English here because this is a very old-fashioned English. I rely on the Hebrew. So all these things will pass over, or I just 1 second. I want to see how it's translated in our Machzor. I have it right here. Don't go away. Don't go away. I have the Machzor. I'm going to look it up for us. For the record, it says, you have to find it. I don't have the page number. I'm looking. Here's the Kedusha. So now I know it's just before. So the translation in our Machzor is, Tshuva, Tefillah, and Tzedakah have the power to transform the harshness of our destiny. That's a pretty good translation. It's a little creative, but I want you to look at the Hebrew. It means that these things can pass over or skirt around at roa, the severity or the evilness of the decree. So what this means is, we can look at the rest of the text. It's also beautiful. We'll have that but I want to focus on the questions raised And then the answer that is proposed by the author, Rabbi Amno, whoever it was, who wrote this beautiful text. The author is saying this, and this is where it's relevant for us, not just for Jews in the 11th century. We live with life with uncertainty. We get ill. We suffer the loss of loved ones. We never know what's going to happen to us tomorrow. That's why we have to live robustly today. We never know if there's going to be a terrorist bomb or another plague. I don't want to be so blunt about it, but we all live with these fears every single day. And in many ways, the author is saying there are a lot of things we have no control over. But remember this, the author is saying, it really doesn't have anything to do whether someone is good or bad, because we know that the good suffer and often the evil are successful. Good people get killed. A lot of Jews have been drowned in the water. A lot of Jews have died from the plague. So it's part of the human fate. This is why we can be angry at God, frankly, because it's really hard to be a human being. This is what's with us all the time. But, and this is so unique to Judaism, we don't have the power to get rid of these fears, but we have the power to alleviate them or make the world a better place. You know, what's interesting here, by the way, if I can point out the drama of this text, you notice here there's no reference in answering these questions to afterlife. And why is that the case? Because it's not that the rabbis didn't agree with that. Olam haba, the idea that the righteous will have their place in the world to come of all peoples of the earth, not just the Jewish people, is not included in this text. You would think that the author would throw that in there. Oh, that would be the easy theology. The righteous might die today, but they'll be rewarded in the world to come, in heaven. The author doesn't say that. And the reason why he doesn't say that is because those were very specific to Christianity and also Islam. The way that those two monotheistic derivatives of Judaism dealt with this issue of why people suffer is by, it's their theology. Forget this world, you'll be rewarded in the world to come. But even in the Middle Ages, and that would have been an easy out. The author of this Unetenah Tokef does not reach that conclusion. Never mentions afterlife. But there's something about that's very Jewish in making this world the place where God's supposed to reign, not in the next world. That's why that's been our major difference with Christianity and Islam, this idea of afterlife, because we all know that the purpose is in our Aleinu prayer, L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, is to perfect this world under the rule of God, this world, not the next world. We don't need Jesus, we don't need Muhammad, we don't need resurrection. This is what we're concerned about. We're going to leave the next world up to God. We're dealing with the pain of being a Jew and a human being today. And this is our response to that, tshuva. And this is taken from the last paragraph of the Shema, the 3 steps towards realization, towards getting closer to God. Tshuva is an internal process. It's about turning into ourselves. It's the first step, recognizing where we need to improve. We can't make the world a better place until we do tshuva, till we understand ourselves so that we can be better Jews and human beings. Tefillah is a turning towards God and a turning towards the community, to the congregation, where we realize from ourselves that we also work together as a community to be a response to a very troubled world. And tzedakah is the final step. V'asitem otam, we say in the Shema, you must do the commandments. Tzedakah is the doing. Internal, outward, and doing. That's the final step. And by doing so, mavirin et roa hagzeira, that is the important step by which we make the world a better. We don't get rid of the evil of the world, but we certainly can alleviate the suffering. So this incredible message, and I'll finish with a couple things and we'll take some questions soon. This is the par excellence Jewish theology in dealing, of course, with the question of theodicy. Now, if you're an atheist, there's nothing to discuss because people suffer, they die, and that's it. But to a religious Jew, and only from a Jewish writer, could this possibly be a response to the question of why people suffer? If there's a plague, find a medical solution. If there's poverty, give to the poor. If there's someone who's alone and suffering, reach out and embrace. Are you going to make the world a perfect place? No, but you're sure as heck going to make it a better place. And this is the power that this writer in the 11th century, even before, felt that we Jews all had. While the world is, you can say that it's crumbling around us, we always have this enormous power that God gave us. The author never gets rid of God. The author, in typical Jewish fashion, like Job and the prophet Isaiah and Jeremiah, and even Moses himself, questions God, but never rejects God. It's a classic Jewish response. Like Elie Wiesel said, when he put God on trial for the Shoah, which, by the way, did happen. It's a true event. That there was a court hearing against God in Auschwitz. And at the end of the hearing, with all of that pain and suffering, the Jews there recited the Kaddish. They affirmed life. They affirmed life. And they were able to respond to the great evils that were befalling them. So in conclusion, and we can certainly have some questions here, this is a masterpiece of what we Jews believe. It is the core of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur service, in my view. There's this rabbi named Reuven Kimmelman who said the Unetenah Tokef is to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur what Lecha Dodi is to the spirit of Shabbat. It's the core tefillah. It's the essence of why we are in synagogue. So it's a very interesting thought. And then there are others who speak as well about the three stages as well, that this refers to our mind. Tefillah is from our tongue, and very much related, by the way, to the story of Amnon, who wanted to have his tongue cut out. Mind, tongue, and doing, the three stages that you could say that Rabbi Amnon took in order to get closer to God. Now, I just want to add a couple of other things, and then we'll get moving then. But let me finish up. There is a very beautiful song written by Leonard Cohen. I hope you've heard of him. He was an interesting poet and songwriter, well-educated Jew, who studied Talmud in Montreal, where he grew up. I don't know what happened in his later years, but he did go to Israel in 1974 in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, and he felt very close to Israel at that time, and he wrote the song "Mihu by Fire," taken after the Unetenah Tokef prayer. It's quite a moving text. So I wrote kind of a summary of this. We cannot dictate our fate in life. We cannot hide from death. We cannot hide from suffering. But there are three things that we can do to bring meaning into the radical uncertainty of our lives. We can ask for forgiveness. We can reach out to God and to each other. And we have the power of love to heal a very broken world. I know I added one more comment here. Oh, in other words, we are not powerless. This has always been the Jewish response, no matter what happens. Adversity is not a punishment. It's part of the realities of our existence. We all experience adversity, whether it be from health or whatever it is, emotional. And that's part of being a human being. But great people we know of all face challenges. We discuss them all the time with Moses and Abraham and Sarah and all of the past. There's sickness. We all come with worries about sickness and aging and financial woes and family stress. We're all human beings. But I'll finish with this. Never allow that which we cannot do to control that which we can do to make our lives and the lives of our troubled world and the Jewish world much better.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My
Thank you.
pleasure. My pleasure here. Okay.
There is a question from the chat. I'll read that, Rabbi.
Good.
And the question goes like this. Were these words meant to be a poem and then became a prayer, or were they written to be a prayer?
That's very interesting. I do not believe that it was written to be a prayer of sorts. I think that was added much later. I think it was written like many of the Piyutim were written over the centuries, not meant to be in our prayer books, but were just written as expressions of, struggle and with God, and that's what we have. Most of the collections of the Piyutim that we have, which were compiled at different stages, were not written to be in the prayer book. They came from the folk, and they were eventually added in our prayer book, and they all appear before the Kedusha, which is very interesting. That's when someone asked me the question, in fact, here, just a couple of weeks ago, Rabbi, can we add prayers to our prayer book? Why are we stuck with what we have? And the answer to that is we know from the history of the prayer book, the Machzor and the Siddur that we use on Shabbat and weekdays, that the creativity, and perhaps this is a challenge to us, Jews wrote all kinds of pieces that were eventually included in our liturgy, was a very dynamic process. And it does raise the question why we feel so set in just keeping the prayers that we have. It's okay to add to the liturgy. The Siddur, the Machzor, is the sacred text of the people, more so than the Torah and any other book. The Siddur, the Machzor, speaks from all the years of how our people express themselves in response to God and being Jewish. And it should be a very fluid text. That's why there's nothing wrong with adding text or even, being very creative with the text that we have. I'm kind of in the middle here as a conservative rabbi. I believe in keeping because, for example, I know there are Reform Machzorim that cut parts of the Unetenah Tokef. And I think this is very unfortunate because these are the text as it's written was meant to be recited in its fullness, and it's beautiful in its fullness. When you start cutting and editing and changing what our ancestors have in mind, I think that we lose the essence of how our prayers were all put together at different stages in history. We see this in the Haggadah at Passover time, different layers of expressions of Jewish life. And to me, it's quite an adventure. We're going to have, maybe not this year because we have our plate full, but to have a class on the history of our liturgy and how our prayers were put together is one of my favorite subjects. And it's fascinating because you hear the voices of Jews from 9th century before the Common Era up to the 1st century and into the Middle Ages. It's like Judaism is a conversation of the generations. And that's exactly what we have in the Matzor. So when I read these prayers, I think of my grandmother reciting them, but I also try to go back to Jews in the Middle Ages who had to deal with different realities that we have. And we hear their voices speaking to us. So it's a very, very good question.
There's another one.
Okay.
You may have touched upon this. Perhaps you'd like to expand upon it. What
Okay.
about the phrase, who shall live and who shall die? Is that part of this prayer? And would you discuss
Yes.
that further?
Oh, that is Miyam Miyamut. That was the, right after the challenge that's made. And it's the dramatic way of saying, we don't know who's going to live and who's going to be alive, even tomorrow. Anything can happen to us. And look at all the things that can happen, drowning and earthquakes and swords and all the things that human beings had to deal with. In that maybe we would have composed it different today. We would have said, who's going to live and who's going to die by COVID-19 and Taliban and all the things that we're dealing with today. But you can use your imagination and just see the words of this prayer resonating with us today as well. So mi yichyeh mi yamut, that is the great drama. We human beings have, God's supposed to be all powerful and we're marching before God. But the fact is, we are powerless. We're not completely. See, that's the big kick at the end. The only thing we have power of is the ability to alleviate the fragility of our human existence. So it's a very interesting back and forth.
I'm looking at screen 1, and if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask in person, I'll be happy to answer them. No, that won't be me. Julie, could you unmute yourself, please?
Great.
And fire away.
Thank you, Rabbi. You touched upon a lot of things that are very meaningful to me. These piyutim have a very special place in my heart. I remember distinctly these prayers before I was bat mitzvah, during my teenage years. This is when the choir would come in, beautiful, and sing whatever melody they chose, the small voice. Okay, that's right. Then I went to another conservative shul before we moved here, where I raised my children. And again, the Shulei Tzibur beautifully sang this piece, and the choir came in. I'm not asking for a choir.
I have those memories too. And this is where, this is really the Chazan's, this is the ultimate one to me. Hineni is very nice. It's the Cantor's meditation before the Musaf repetition. But Unetenah Tokef, to me, is even more powerful than the Kol Nidre. I get very emotionally wrapped up. Maybe it's because of, the words of my grandmother shared with me and my father and mother, but I also have memories as a child in synagogue, and boy, I remember seeing the Cantor's face, literally the veins of the face explode when he would be shrine, mi yichyeh mi yamut. And you're right, when you got to Kol D'Mamataka, a complete change with the silence, the quiet of God's voice. Anyways, all the emotions are there. And I'm sure Cantor Geiger is going to do well with it. It's the real test of the Chazan. I don't want to put pressure on him, but there's so much room here for loud and soft and this buildup, the pain. Why are we dealing with all of this? And then the relief, utshuva, utafila, utzedaka mavirin et roa hagazera. It's like, I'm exhausted already, and finally I have maybe something that I can hold on to. These are the emotions I go through.
And this phrase is said by all the congregation in response to the piyutim that have been read to us, hopefully beautifully. But it's the whole corpus, the whole congregation that says, yes, these are true, but this is what we can do. And I think you explained that beautifully. Thank you.
I try to. To me, it's it's the pearl of the holidays. And I hope that, we don't have everybody here, but I hope when we get to Unetenah Tokef that you'll have a greater awareness of the majesty of, I mean, when I read this text, the way, what we didn't spend a lot of time going through the use of the Hebrew words, the, one word at a time, this buildup is built into the literary structure of the text as well. We went through it rather quickly, but it's just an absolute masterpiece. And as I mentioned, I think it's one of the greatest liturgical, God to be one of the greatest liturgical compositions. And we recite the Shema. We know how old that is. We recite the Amidah, but in terms of emotional power, this expression that came out of somebody, or who knows, we really don't know who wrote it, from that period of time. It's just incredible. It's so modern too. You imagine we're reciting this prayer which is at least 1,000 years old, could be 1,400 years old. And I wouldn't change a word for today's situation. It's absolutely, unbelievably perfect in terms of a composition and a theological motif. It's everything. I'm getting emotional just thinking about the rest of the recitation in shul in a week or so, a little more than a week.
While we're unmuted, could I ask a question too, please?
Sure.
Of course.
In the passage, Kain ta'avir, v'tispor, v'tinet, v'tifkod. That v'tifkod, that poked also sometimes means to redeem. So is there a kind of a double entendre here where we're slipping something in? We want God to redeem us. He's not just counting us.
I'm going to be doing this on Shabbat with a couple of words from our Torah portion and the double entendre, the double meanings in the same word. So you're absolutely right. There's so much just in the word avar. There's so many double thick meanings in each of the words of this text. Absolutely. Pikudim, which, we have a portion, Pikudim, in the end of the book of Exodus, refers to the numbering, the very specific details of every human being. You almost hear the plea, and you're right, and to remember, God, will you remember everything that's going on here? I can't deal with a universe in which I can't even imagine a God not taking note. Pikudim are notes. What's Pakdan is an office clerk in modern Hebrew, one who's got to keep exact notes. So it's really a challenge with God. Are you keeping note of what's going on here? Are you looking and seeing how people are suffering here, dear God? Because we're taking notes. We're taking notes of you. And we want you to keep notes. We want to be remembered. It's fantastic. Just in that one word.
We have time. We can take one more question from the audience. And if not, and I don't see anybody's hand raised. So with that, I will thank Rabbi Altshuler for a wonderful presentation. I will thank the audience. I will thank Al Tridell again and Elliot Korn. And I will ask our president if you would like to say a few closing words. Mr. President.
Thank you, Marshall. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Altshuler.
Thank you, Eric.
On behalf of all the congregants tonight, and if there are any visitors to the site as well, I really want to thank you most sincerely for such an erudite presentation. Every time we hear you, you just continue to raise the bar higher and higher. So this is truly wonderful.
I love what I do. I want to thank you for giving me the privilege of sharing what I love the most. And
Thank
so
you.
I hope you note that.
Thank you. Your presentations are so erudite. They are so complete. Your dissection of the Unetenah Tokef tonight was like we've never heard it before. So I think we'll all approach Yom Kippur with renewed interest and enthusiasm, and above all, understanding. Everything was so appropriate for tonight, especially as the world faces disease and war, man's inhumanity to man. So this is really so appropriate for this evening. Hearing you tonight makes us all wait with bated breath for your sermons on our holy days. So once again, on behalf of all of us here tonight, a very big thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. It's with great love, all of you. Thanks for your support. And I look forward to being with you, and we'll share our emotions and our spirit, our nishamot together when we welcome the new year with all the questions and worries that we have about ourselves, but certainly about the wider world, which is also part of who we are. So thank you for this great time. We have many more opportunities to learn and share with each other. I always learn from you. So I thank you for that as well. Thank you so much, Eric, Esme, and Marshall, my best. And to all of you, L'Shana Tova. It's not too early to wish everybody a good Shana Tova Umetuka, a sweet year as well. The world needs a lot of sweetness. All I can say too, I always think about this, and I come every Shabbat. I never take it for granted, whatever we're doing, that the world might be crazy, and it really is. I'm sure you all have your moments where you say, what the heck is going on out there? And we've created our little beautiful place, a shalom bayit, a piece of the house. And we should never forget how special it is, because we are saying to the world, it doesn't have to be your way. It can be our way. And I sense this every time I'm with you. So let's keep doing what we're doing, because it's pretty darn good.
Thank you, Rabbi, for those closing words. So that concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you, everybody, once again for attending. And we look forward to more presentations from the Continuing Education Committee and the Rabbi. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Laila Tov, everybody.
Laila Tov.
Stay well. See you Shabbat. Bye-bye. Bye, Jeff.